I'm Phil Howard. I'm a faculty member in Community Food and Agriculture at Michigan State University. So I teach and conduct research looking at the food system, which is all of the steps involved in producing food, getting it to our plates, basically. It's a process. There's a lot of back and forth. Sometimes I start with the biggest food processors in the world and see how they're involved in organic, and then sometimes I look at what are the biggest selling organic brands, who's involved with those. So it's just kind of working from both sides and trying to figure out, at least for the biggest brands, the biggest companies, who's ultimately the owner of that brand. Of the top 30 food processors in North America, almost half have gotten involved in the organic industry, either through acquisitions or introducing an organic version of one of their existing brands. So for something that started as a tiny niche, it's really been interesting to see how quickly most of the biggest corporations involved in the food industry have gotten involved in organic. Had the biggest corporations not gotten involved in organic, you still would have seen that kind of growth. I mean, there was the growth rates that preceded the corporate interest have simply been maintained. So it's more of, rather than having a lot of independent organic companies, that same market share is now controlled by a smaller number of big corporations. And it just shows that the growth rates have been about 20% a year between 1990 and 2008. So it's basically exponential growth, and where you see a doubling of the industry roughly every 3-something years. Now that's slowed because of the recent economic downturn, back down to about 7%, but it's still faster than the rest of the food industry. So there's still a lot of interest in, corporations want more and more profits, so they're going to focus on areas that are growing faster than the rest of the food industry. Corporations are not very good at innovating, but they're very good at buying up small companies that have innovated. So they're seeing organic reaching mainstream status, and they want to get involved through acquisitions rather than creating organic lines themselves. So that's one reason. Another is the price premiums for organic. Typical organic product compared to a product that's not organic, that's otherwise the same, is going to cost more. And just those margins give higher profits for corporations, particularly for the processed foods, which they are typically involved with.
Do you think that mainstreaming is happening more at a localized level or a broader scale?
I think it's both. I mean, you have, you can go into Walmart and buy Nabisco organic Oreos, or you can go in a lot of places. You see a lot of farmers markets popping up. And you have farmers that are selling organic produce, and there's a huge gulf between those two types of organic products.
In terms of global versus local, these are both offering us an alternative. Is there one or the other that you think is more beneficial, or do they go hand in hand?
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy to say we can be 100% local or 100% global. I mean, if you look at any product, there are things that are, like coffee, that just don't grow in the United States, that have always been imported from far away. And then there are things like potatoes that are expensive to ship and tend to be produced locally, even by big corporations. So, I think there are benefits to a localized, having more food that's localized, rather than importing cookies from Denmark. We have the capability to make cookies here, and we have more of a say in how that's produced. We're going to use less fossil fuel in the production and transport of something that's produced and consumed locally. So there are a lot of benefits to kind of bringing back from the extreme globalized food economy that we have now. things that just really don't make sense. To ship milk from New Zealand to the United States when we have an excess supply of milk already. There are those kinds of irrationalities that I think would be addressed by working to make a more local food system. Before that, we had a national organic standard. We had different state and regional standards. They weren't all the same, which wasn't a problem if you were a small company. You were only producing and distributing in that region or state. But if you're a multinational corporation, you don't want to deal with a lot of different standards. So they were a major driver of introducing a national organic standard. And the USDA wasn't very favorable towards organics in 1990 when the legislation was passed, and they kind of stalled. But by 1997, they signaled that they were actually going to do something. They introduced some draft standards, which were very controversial, but it signaled that a national standard was going to happen. And that was the time you saw a lot of venture capitalists start getting involved in the organic industry, buying up food processors, organic brands, in many cases bundling them together and then selling them to a big transnational corporation. You also had transnationals making their own acquisitions. So from 1997, when the National Organic Standard was a draft was proposed, to 2002, when it was actually implemented, you saw a huge wave of acquisitions and a lot of consolidation within the organic industry, to the point where by 2007, you basically had little over a dozen of these pioneering independent organic food companies that remained independent. All dozens and dozens of other companies had been acquired by then. Petroleum companies, chemical companies started getting involved in the seed industry with corn in the 70s. They saw some profit opportunities there. But it was the 90s where you had these mergers between chemical and pharmaceutical companies, a lot of interest in genetic engineering, and it was basically the patent protections, these legal protections on seeds that drove all of this interest. So in the 1990s, Monsanto, big chemical pharmaceutical company that wasn't even involved in the seed industry, got involved. They're now the biggest seed company in the world. They've made over 50 acquisitions in a span of less than 15 years. Half a dozen of these that were at a price of $1 billion or more. And they started with those heavily subsidized field crops like corn and soybeans, but they've now moved into fruit and vegetable seeds. And they're taking seeds like soybeans, which a farmer could biologically replant every year, in contrast to corn. Most corn's hybrid, and it doesn't work to replant it. You have to go back to the company every year and buy new seed. Now with soybeans, there are these intellectual property protections because of genetically engineered traits. So the farmers have to go back to the company every year, and that's why it's so profitable now than it was just a few decades ago. Those big 6 chemical corporations all have cross-licensing agreements. So if they invest a lot of money and develop a new technology, they tend to license that technology to other companies. So these 6 companies can stack up all of these traits that have these patent protections and sell them. But for a small seed company that doesn't have that research capacity, that can't create a patent-protected trait, they're at a competitive disadvantage if farmers want that trait. They either have to form some kind of alliance with a company that is owned by one of those chemical companies, or agree to be acquired by that company, by a chemical company. And organic is, big corporations these days. I mean, the USDA standard is such that corporations are satisfied with it. I mean, they're always working to try and weaken those standards in ways that benefit them. An example is Anheuser-Busch. They wanted to produce an organic beer. Organic hops were expensive, so they went to the USDA and said, could we have an exemption and just have organic beer with conventional hops? And there were people within the USDA who were fine with that, but there was a lot of outcry, and so that they're not doing that anymore. But organic in the early days may have been seen as a threat, but now it's been mainstream to the point that the biggest food company in the world, Nestle, has been acquiring organic companies. It's just part of the status quo now. I think it's other things like raw milk that are seen as a threat to the big dairy companies. Yeah, I think there's kind of a disjuncture for consumers. Consumers tend to think, particularly mainstream organic consumers think of the health benefits first. They're looking to avoid synthetic pesticides when they're buying organic food. But probably the bigger impact is ecological. When you're doing organic farming, the standards say things about improving the soil. You're reducing the fossil fuels that go into the production of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Organic farms tend to be more diverse. That's one of the ways that you control insect pests without synthetic pesticides, is to have more diversity and not have a monoculture that's very susceptible to pests. So I would say the ecological impacts of organic agriculture are one of the key benefits. In a way, organic is already incredibly mainstream. The latest statistics I've seen show that over 80% of the U.S. population consumes organic food at least occasionally. And that doesn't mean they're buying it every week. You're looking at a much smaller percentage of the population, maybe less than a quarter of the population that would buy organic foods every week, but it's become so mainstream you can get it anywhere. You can buy organic foods at McDonald's and Starbucks and Walmart and Costco. So I think it is an interesting example for other efforts to create alternatives to show here's a real success. Here's something that was started by some very idealistic farmers in the mid 20th century, and now is over 4% of all food sales, and almost everyone knows what organic is. I think you're going to always have people who remember the early days and the stereotypes, and are going to be very skeptical of it, but for most people it's very mainstream these days. The food system has become so complex that we don't really know what we're supporting when we make a purchase, and it takes a lot of effort to find out what kind of system you're really supporting, and then does it include the values you want to support, or is it involve something like child slavery for cocoa production in Africa. Those are things that we don't know from the label. It's really hard to find out. So that's part of what I do, is trying to the things that are a little easier to figure out, at least for me, like ownership, make those more apparent to people. Because in the organic industry, that ownership is often hidden. You might buy an organic brand and have no clue that it's actually owned by Kellogg or General Mills. I always encourage people to, number one, grow their own food, even on a small scale. That way you have control. Just sprouting, you don't need any space for that. So that's a way you can get fresh, nutritious sprouts, and you get experience in growing your own food. From there, you can branch out and start growing your own tomatoes and other products. Or buying directly from the farmer is the next best thing. A farmer where you can visit their operation and see what they're doing. Farmers markets are a great place where you can buy from farmers and ask questions about what they're doing, and let them know what type of food system you want. And then co-ops. Co-ops are member-owned, so you have a say in how the co-op is run, what kind of products are on the shelves. I've talked to a lot of co-ops around the country, and it's democracy in action. You have people debating on whether or not they should carry a certain product. Some co-ops have dropped products from China. Some co-ops don't sell meat, for example. So that's a retailer where you can have a voice in what's on the shelves. And then I suggest people seek out those independent organic companies that haven't been acquired, because they have really strong principles to be able to resist the buyout offers that they're receiving on a weekly or even daily basis. Every independent company I've talked to has had a huge amount of interest from big corporations that want to continue to consolidate that industry. But these companies have said, we don't like what's happened to other companies that have been acquired, and how the ideals have been watered down. The integrity is just not there. So supporting those independent organic companies.
This greenhouse, this is a passive solar hoop house at the Student Organic Farm. They're able to produce vegetables in here year-round without any heat. Basically, there are only certain vegetables that you can do during the winter, and sometimes it does get a little bit below freezing. But with things like Swiss chard and stuff, they can take that and they acclimate to it to some extent. They don't grow a lot during the winter, but then that's basically a live storage system. So instead of having this stuff in a cooler where it's going to last 4 weeks, you have it in the ground where it'll last for 4 months.
It's almost as if organic feels like going back to what we were in the beginning.
In a way, it started out like that to a certain extent. It was the movement started in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. The British diet at the time was margarine and bread and canned meat, and there were a number of people that were looking at the health of other cultures that were growing a lot of crops and that had vegetable-based, yogurt-based, fresh meat diets, and it was also a rejection of the notion that 3 nutrients could replenish the soil and grow crops of the same nutritional value, of the same quality. With the advent of the National Organic Program, we've seen huge increases. For a while it was 19% a year in organic sales, and that's great, but not all organic is equal, and there are different ways to do it, and I personally am really happy to see more organic farms. What you call a corporate farm and what you call a family farm there's some gray area there as well, and there are some very, very large family farms, and there are some small farms that are incorporated, but in general, the number of very large farms that are producing organic food has really increased. Organic farms are now a little bit less than 1% of the total number of farms in the United States, and a little bit less than 1% of the total acreage of farms in the United States. But the growth has been really, really rapid, and it depends a lot on the crop. For instance, I think organic corn is maybe 0.2% of the market or something like that. It's small. Whereas organic carrots are 15%. Organic lettuce is 8%. And so it's a little bit deceiving when you look at the number of organic farms as very small and the total acreage is very small, because often organic farms are growing high value crops. If you look at this farm here, on the square footage here, they're producing a heck of a lot of food, and the same square footage in corn. Sustainability as returning organic matter to the soil and encouraging microbial activity in the soil, and really building the soil as the base of the plant. And that's a fundamental value in organic. You've probably heard feed the soil, not the plant, and that's really what a lot of the values-based organic farmers try to do. And there's also a certain amount of that built into the rules that govern the National Organic Program, which certifies organic growers. Feeding the soil, feeds healthier plants, feeds healthier animals, feeds healthier people, feeds healthier communities. And that is fundamental to the values component of organic. There is the myth that organic farms don't use pesticides, and they do, but they don't rely on, they tend not to rely on them as a first source of defense. And there are very strict rules on what pesticides can be used and when, and it has to really be necessary. And the more toxic ones, even if they're natural, there are some pretty toxic natural pesticides, can only be used in emergency situations. And when you're feeding the soil and you have healthy soil, and you tend to have healthy plants, and that diminishes the need. One of the big problems, one of the big criticisms of the National Organic Program is that it sets a ceiling rather than a floor. So basically, the way that the rules are written, you can only claim if you're organic if you follow the rules and you have your inspections and stuff like that. But an inspector can't say, well, our rules are going to be a little bit stricter. It's capped at these are the rules, and this is organic, and there's it doesn't allow organizations that do the inspections to require more than the rules. And organic farming, it is an improvement, but I don't want to portray it as the solution to. Here we are sitting in a greenhouse that all these steel beams and all of this plastic. It takes energy to make it. Plastic's a petroleum product. They're still using tractors. Yeah, and it's an attempt at more responsibly managing the system that we're in, but it's not that black and white. And you know, there are and a lot of organic farmers struggle with it. You know, they have to make a living, and so yeah, a lot of people would rather not use you know, plastic, but you have to be able to keep the farm going. You have to be able to make a living